This warning has to reach you before tomorrow, not because something terrible is about to happen, but because something extraordinary is already happening. And if you don't understand what's going on, if you mistake this for a breakdown instead of a breakthrough, you could fight against the very thing that's trying to save you. Right now, in this exact moment, your old self is collapsing, not metaphorically, not eventually, but actually collapsing. And most people, when this happens to them, they panic. They think they're losing their minds, falling apart, regressing, failing. But Carl Jung knew better. He spent decades documenting this exact process, and what he found will change everything you think you know about who you are. This collapse isn't your end, it's your beginning. But only if you stop fighting it. Only if you recognize the signs before it's too late. There are 3 unmistakable signs that your old self is dying. 3 patterns that prove you're not breaking down, you're breaking through. And if even one of these is happening to you right now, everything you're experiencing, the confusion, the emptiness, the feeling that nothing makes sense anymore, it all has a purpose. But here's what you need to understand. This process doesn't wait for you to be ready. It doesn't ask permission, it just happens. And tomorrow when you wake up, you'll be one day deeper into this transformation. So you need to hear this now while there's still time to understand what's happening, while you can still choose to work with this force instead of against it. Because the people who fight this collapse, they suffer for years. But the people who understand it, who recognize these signs and surrender to the process, they emerge as something entirely new. I'm going to show you the 3 signs. But first you need to know what Jung discovered about this collapse that no one talks about. Your identity, everything you think of as you, your personality, your beliefs, your story, none of it is permanent. It's a construction, and like all constructions, it has a lifespan. Jung called this construction the ego, not in the way most people use that word, but as the psychological structure that holds your sense of self together. It's the narrator of your life story. The one who says, I am this kind of person, I believe these things, this is who I've always been. And for most of your life this structure works perfectly fine. It helps you navigate the world, make decisions, maintain relationships. But then something happens. Maybe it's a crisis, a loss, a betrayal. Maybe it's nothing dramatic at all, just a slow accumulation of experiences that don't fit your story anymore. And suddenly, the construction starts to crack. The ego, that stable sense of who you are, begins to collapse. And when it does, it feels like you're losing yourself entirely. Jung documented this collapse across hundreds of his patients. He watched people who seemed perfectly functional suddenly fall apart, successful people who couldn't get out of bed, confident people who questioned everything about themselves, happy people who felt nothing at all. And what he realized changed psychology forever. This wasn't pathology, this was evolution. The ego was collapsing because it had to. Because underneath that constructed self was something real, something Jung called the self with a capital S, the true core of who you actually are. And the only way that true self could emerge was if the false self got out of the way. But here's the terrifying part. When the ego collapses, there's a period where you exist in between identities, where the old you is gone but the new you hasn't fully formed yet. Jung called this the liminal space. Others call it the dark night of the soul. It's a psychological death, and like all deaths, it's supposed to feel like the end. But it's not the end, it's the space where transformation happens. And the 3 signs I'm about to show you, they're proof that you're in that space right now. Sign number 1, nothing that used to matter still matters. This is the first and most disorienting sign of ego collapse. The things you once cared deeply about, your goals, your ambitions, your plans for the future, they suddenly feel empty. Not disappointing, not frustrating, just empty. Like you're looking at someone else's life. You used to wake up with purpose, you knew what you wanted, you had a clear vision of where you were going. But now everything feels pointless. That career you worked so hard to build, you don't care about it anymore. That relationship you thought was everything, it feels like a performance. Those dreams you chased for years, they seem ridiculous now, like they belong to someone else. And the scariest part is you can't force yourself to care again. You've tried, you've given yourself pep talks, told yourself to snap out of it, reminded yourself of all the reasons these things should matter, but nothing works. This terrifies most people. They think they're becoming depressed, losing motivation, giving up on life. But Jung would tell you something completely different. He'd say your ego is releasing its attachments. Because the ego, your constructed self, it built its identity around those goals, those relationships, those dreams. And now that it's collapsing, it's letting go of everything it used to grip so tightly. This isn't apathy, this is discernment. Your true self, the one trying to emerge, it sees through all the things the ego convinced you mattered. It knows which pursuits were authentic and which were just conditioning. It can feel the difference between what you truly want and what you were taught to want. And it's systematically dismantling everything that isn't real. Jung found this pattern in every case of ego collapse he studied. People would come to him devastated because they no longer cared about things they'd spent their whole lives pursuing. They felt broken. But Jung recognized what was actually happening. These people were being freed from the prison of other people's expectations, freed from the burden of maintaining an identity that was never truly theirs. Let me give you a real example from Jung's work. He had a patient, a successful businessman who woke up one day and couldn't bring himself to care about his company anymore. Everything he'd built, everything he'd sacrificed for, it all felt meaningless. He thought he was having a breakdown. He was terrified. But Jung asked him one question that changed everything. If you could do anything in the world right now, without thinking about money or success or what other people would think, what would you do? The man couldn't answer, not because he didn't know, but because the answer terrified him. He'd always wanted to teach, to work with children, to create something that mattered beyond profit. But his ego, his constructed self, had built an entire identity around being a successful businessman. And that identity wouldn't allow those other desires to exist. So they got buried, until the ego started collapsing, until it lost its grip. And suddenly, those buried desires came rushing to the surface. This is what's happening to you right now. The things that don't matter anymore. They're the things your ego needed to feel valid, but your soul never actually wanted. And the feeling of emptiness you're experiencing, that's not depression, that's clarity. Your true self is showing you what was never yours to begin with. But here's where it gets even stranger. Because the second sign doesn't just show you what you don't want anymore. It shows you that you don't know who you are at all. Sign number 2, you can't remember who you used to be. This one is haunting. You try to recall the person you were just 6 months ago, maybe a year ago, and it's like looking at a stranger. You remember the events, you remember what happened, but you can't access the person who experienced those things. It's as if that person existed in a dream, and now you've woken up. You look at old photos and think, who is that? You read old messages and wonder, did I really say that? You remember goals you used to have, opinions you used to hold, and they feel foreign, like they belong to someone you used to know but don't anymore. This memory loss isn't medical, it's psychological. Jung would call this dissociation from the ego. Your conscious mind is separating from the identity it used to inhabit, because that identity is dying. Think about it like this. When you remember your past, you're not actually remembering objective events. You're remembering the story your ego told about those events, the narrative it constructed to make sense of your life. But now that the ego is collapsing, that narrative is falling apart. And without the narrative, the memories lose their emotional connection to who you are now. Jung observed this in his own life. During his famous confrontation with the unconscious, his own ego collapse, he wrote about feeling disconnected from his past self. He couldn't understand how he'd believed certain things, how he'd acted in certain ways. It was as if he was reviewing someone else's life, not his own, and this terrified him, until he realized what was actually happening. The old story was dying so a new story could be written. Not a better story, not a worse story, but a true story. Here's what makes this so unsettling. When you can't remember who you used to be, you also can't predict who you're becoming. You exist in a state of complete uncertainty. You wake up every day not knowing what you'll care about, what you'll want, how you'll react to things. Your personality feels unstable, shifting, unreliable, and everyone around you notices. They say things like, "You've changed," or "I don't recognize you anymore," or "What happened to the old you?" And you can't give them an answer because you don't have one. Most people, when they reach this point, they panic. They try to reconstruct the old identity. They force themselves to act like they used to act, think like they used to think, want what they used to want. But it doesn't work, because you can't rebuild something that's meant to die. Jung had another patient who described this perfectly. She said it felt like she was a ghost haunting her own life, walking through her days, interacting with people, but not really there, not really present. Because the person those people knew, that person was gone. And she was terrified that she'd never feel real again. But Jung told her something that changed her entire perspective. He said, "You're not a ghost, you're a seed. Right now, you're underground in the dark, and it feels like death. But you're not dying, you're germinating. And germination requires the complete dissolution of the old form so the new form can emerge. This is what's happening to you. The reason you can't remember who you used to be is because that person is being composted, broken down into raw material, so something new can grow from what remains. And the uncertainty you feel right now, that's not confusion, that's potential. Pure, unformed potential waiting to take shape. But you have to let the old self finish dying first. You have to stop trying to resurrect what's meant to decompose. Because if you don't, you'll be stuck in this liminal space forever, half dead and half alive, unable to move forward or go back. And that brings us to the third sign, the one that proves beyond any doubt that your transformation is inevitable. Sign number 3, you're being pulled towards something you can't name. This is the strangest and most profound sign of all. Even though nothing matters anymore, even though you can't remember who you are, there's still something pulling you forward. Not a goal, not a plan, not a clear destination, just a pull, a direction. A sense that you're being guided towards something even though you have no idea what it is. It feels like intuition but stronger, like destiny but less dramatic, like you're following a thread you can't see, but you know, is there. You make decisions that don't make sense. You're drawn to places, people, experiences that have no logical connection to your life. You start doing things you've never done before, thinking thoughts you've never thought, feeling feelings you've never felt, and you can't explain why, you just know you're supposed to. Jung called this the pull of the self. When the ego collapses, when that constructed identity falls away, the true self beneath it finally gets a chance to speak, and it speaks through this pull. This isn't your conscious mind making plans. This is something deeper, something that knows things your conscious mind doesn't know, guiding you toward the life you're actually meant to live. But here's what makes this so difficult. The ego, even as it's collapsing, fights back. It doesn't want to die, and so it creates doubt. It tells you this pull is crazy, irresponsible, naive. It reminds you of all the practical reasons you should ignore what you're feeling and go back to what makes sense. It weaponizes fear, shame, guilt, anything to make you stop following this invisible thread. Jung saw this battle in every patient going through ego collapse, the dying ego waging war against the emerging self. And most people, they side with the ego, because the ego is familiar, it's known. Even if it's killing them, at least it's predictable. But the self is unknown. It's asking them to trust something they can't see, follow something they can't name, become someone they can't imagine, and that's terrifying. Let me tell you about one of Jung's most powerful cases. A woman came to him completely lost. Her marriage had ended, her career had stalled, her entire life felt like it was falling apart, and she couldn't understand why. She'd done everything right, followed all the rules, made all the sensible choices, but none of it worked anymore. And now she felt this strange pull towards something she couldn't articulate. She wanted to leave her city, move somewhere remote, start over completely, but she couldn't explain why. It made no practical sense. Jung asked her, "What happens if you don't follow this pull?" She said, "I die. Not physically, but something in me dies." And Jung recognized immediately what was happening. Her ego, the identity she'd constructed around being the good wife, the successful professional, the responsible daughter, it was collapsing. And her true self, the one buried under all those roles, was finally trying to emerge. That pull she felt, that was her soul's compass, pointing her toward her actual life, the one she was always meant to live, but never had the courage to choose. Jung told her, "This pull you're feeling, it's not random, it's not irrational, it's the most rational thing about you right now, because it's coming from the only part of you that's real. Everything else, all the reasons you think you should ignore it, those are coming from the identity that's dying, and that identity is fighting for its survival. But it's already lost. The only question is whether you're going to make this easy or hard. This is where you are right now, caught between the dying ego and the emerging self. And that pull you're feeling, that inexplicable draw towards something you can't name, that's the most important thing in your life right now. More important than making sense, more important than other people's approval, more important than safety or security, or any of the things your collapsing ego is trying to convince you matter more. Because that pull is your true self trying to lead you home. And if you ignore it now, if you let the dying ego convince you to play it safe, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what could have been. You'll survive, but you won't be alive. And that's the real tragedy Jung witnessed over and over. People who made it to the threshold of transformation but turned back at the last moment, who felt the pull but didn't follow it, who let their old self die but never allowed the new self to be born. They spent the rest of their lives in that liminal space, that psychological purgatory, neither who they were nor who they could be, just existing in the gap. Jung called these people the living dead, and he said they were everywhere, walking through their lives like ghosts, going through the motions, never quite present, never quite real, because they refused to complete the death. They clung to pieces of the old identity, tried to resurrect parts of the ego that were meant to stay buried, and in doing so, they blocked the rebirth. But here's what Jung also discovered. It's never too late. As long as you're alive, as long as you're conscious, the self will keep pulling. It will keep trying to guide you home, and all you have to do is listen. All you have to do is trust. All you have to do is take one step in the direction that scares you most. So let me tell you what happens next. let me show you what's on the other side of this collapse. Because right now you're in the worst part, the part where the old self is dying but the new self hasn't fully emerged, where nothing makes sense and everything feels unstable. But this doesn't last forever. Jung mapped out the entire process. He documented what happens when people stop fighting the collapse and start working with it. And what he found was extraordinary. First, the confusion starts to lift. Not all at once, but gradually. You begin to notice patterns in the chaos, synchronicities that feel too perfect to be coincidence, doors opening exactly when you need them to, people appearing who say exactly what you need to hear. It's like the universe is conspiring to guide you. And in a way it is. Because when the ego collapses, when that constructed self gets out of the way, you become permeable to guidance that was always there but couldn't get through before. Jung called this synchronicity. The meaningful coincidences that prove you're on the right path. And during ego collapse, synchronicities multiply. Because you're finally aligned with your true trajectory, the one your soul has been trying to follow your entire life. Second, you start to remember who you really are. Not who you used to be, not the constructed identity, but who you are underneath all of that. The person you were before the world told you who to be. Before you learned to perform, to please, to pretend, you start accessing memories from childhood, from before the ego fully formed, and you recognize yourself in those memories in a way you haven't felt in decades. Third, and this is the most profound shift, you stop caring what other people think, not in a rebellious way, not in an aggressive way, but in a deeply peaceful way, because you realize that other people's opinions were never about you. They were about their own projections, their own fears, their own unmet needs, and none of that has anything to do with who you actually are. Jung found that people who completed ego collapse became almost immune to external validation, not because they were arrogant, but because they had found an internal source of worth that no one could touch. They knew who they were, and that knowing was unshakable. But here's what you need to understand. None of this happens if you fight the collapse. None of this happens if you try to hold on to the old self, if you resist the pull, if you let fear make your decisions. The transformation only completes if you surrender. And surrender doesn't mean giving up. It means giving in to the process, to the mystery, to the unknown person you're becoming. So here's what you do tonight. Before you go to sleep, I want you to do something Jung recommended to every patient going through ego collapse. Sit in silence for 10 minutes, no phone, no distractions, and ask yourself 3 questions. What am I afraid to let go of? What is pulling me forward? Who am I without my story? Don't force answers, just sit with the questions, let them echo in the silence. Because these questions, they're not meant to be answered by your mind, they're meant to be answered by yourself, the true one, the one that's trying to emerge. And if you listen, really listen, you'll hear it. Not in words, but in a feeling, a knowing, a certainty that has no logical explanation but feels more true than anything your mind could produce. That's your compass. That's how you navigate this collapse. Not with logic, not with plans, not with the voices of everyone telling you what you should do, but with that quiet knowing that only speaks when everything else falls silent. Tomorrow, you'll wake up, and the collapse will still be happening. Your old self will still be dying, but now you'll know what it means. Now you'll recognize the signs. Now you'll understand that this isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of your real one, the one you were always meant to live, the one your soul has been waiting your entire life to finally choose. Jung spent decades studying transformation, and the one thing he knew for certain was this: the people who make it through ego collapse don't just survive, they become who they were always meant to be. Not a better version of their old self, not an improved identity, but something entirely new, something that couldn't exist until everything else died first. This is your moment, this is your initiation, this is the death that leads to rebirth, and everything depends on whether you recognize it for what it is. So stop fighting, stop trying to go back, stop clinging to who you used to be, let the old self collapse, let it die completely. Because on the other side of this death is a life you can't imagine from where you're standing now. A life that's actually yours, not the one you were given, not the one you constructed, but the one your soul has been trying to give you since the moment you were born. And when you finally step into that life, when you finally become who you really are, you'll look back at this collapse and understand it wasn't trying to destroy you, it was trying to free you. If you're still watching, if you've made it this far, that means you're ready, ready to let go, ready to trust the pull, ready to become who you're afraid to be. Drop a comment telling me which sign resonated most, because the people who recognize these patterns, they're the ones who make it through. They're the ones who emerge transformed. Your old self is collapsing, and that's the best thing that's ever happened to you. Until next time, trust the process and become real.